There are cities in the United States where silence seems to have conquered too much territory. Places that, just a few years ago, competed in lights, in movement, in the promise of the future, now exhibit an emptiness that shouldn't exist in a country built on the idea of infinite prosperity. Those who walk these streets feel that something essential has been ripped away, not explosively, but slowly, like a disease that settles in silently until the body no longer has the strength to fight. Back. The avenues once marked by the constant flow of cars and voices now harbor long shadows, locked doors, and signs that no longer light up. What's striking is not just what has disappeared, but what remained: intact facades, solid structures, vestiges of a normality that no longer exists. It's like watching a sleeping giant beneath layers of dust, guarding stories that no one dares to tell anymore. And among these structures, an unsettling feeling arises that the abandonment was not an accident, but the result of something that grew silently, hidden in plain sight. Behind the scenes, economists, former residents, and authorities are beginning to admit what was previously denied. There are entire sectors of the American map where the promise of the dream has been replaced by a social blackout that spreads like a crack in glass, first imperceptible, then impossible to ignore. And before moving on, the inevitable question arises, the one that starts every serious investigation. This started so suddenly, or were there always signs and we just didn't want to see them? Before continuing this investigation, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This ensures you receive each new chapter of this series and helps us keep this type of independent content online. Let's continue. When one carefully observes what is spreading through American cities, it becomes increasingly impossible to ignore that decay has ceased to be a distant warning and has become a constant presence, embedded in details that most prefer not to confront. The shelves still seem stocked, the buildings remain standing, and the infrastructure maintains a superficial appearance of normality. But one only needs to walk a few blocks beyond the tourist areas to realize that something essential has been lost along the way, opening a deep fissure between what the country projects and what it actually experiences. This contradiction manifests itself silently, almost shamefully, as if the nation itself were trying to hide from view what has already become evident to those who live within this daily life. In once bustling neighborhoods, shops that operated for decades now display sealed doors and faded signs, bearing witness to an era that has vanished without ceremony. Local commerce, the mainstay of community life, crumbles in sequence, creating entire corridors where the only sound is the wind passing through broken windows and abandoned structures. The impact is not limited to the establishments. Entire families have disappeared from these areas, leaving empty streets that were once filled with children playing, workers returning home, and neighbors who knew each other by name. The human absence becomes so striking that some stretches seem to have been deserted overnight, as if a silent evacuation had occurred while no one was paying attention. At the same time, the number of people living in cars parked near residential areas is growing, seeking some semblance of security, while trying to reorganize their lives amidst the economic chaos that advances with the subtlety of a lengthening shadow. These rarely publicized stories represent the reality of a middle class that can no longer sustain the promised lifestyle, facing personal collapse even before national collapse. And it is in this scenario, where normality hangs by increasingly fragile threads, that a disturbing question arises that deserves to be confronted without filters. Is all this simply a consequence of an economic cycle? Or is there a deeper, more intentional cause behind this growing silence? Comment. Do you believe this crisis was created or merely allowed? Upon closer analysis of what underpins this progressive emptying of American cities, it becomes evident that the crisis cannot be attributed solely to random circumstances or natural economic fluctuations. There are concrete signs that quieter, strategically positioned processes have been gradually and deliberately shaping the social landscape. These signs appear in corporate reports, under-discussed urban policies, and financial decisions that, combined, reveal a complex mechanism operating behind the scenes and producing devastating effects on entire regions, without most of the population realizing the extent of the damage that accumulates year after year. Large corporations, attracted by incentives that benefit only their own interests, abandon cities that have sustained their operations for decades, leaving behind entire communities that depended on those jobs to survive. At the same time, financial conglomerates expand their profits by encouraging massive indebtedness, operating mechanisms that trap families in cycles that are almost impossible to break. This set of factors not only accelerates collective impoverishment, but also fragments the social structure that once held community relations together, transforming entire populations into statistics that rarely gain space in public discussions. In addition, policies that should offer emergency support end up prioritizing the interests of specific sectors, leaving the most vulnerable areas adrift and without the means for even minimal reorganization. The result is a process of deterioration that spreads steadily, going almost unnoticed at first glance, but becoming evident when observing the accumulated impact on small towns, which act as true barometers of everything that begins to collapse. Before reaching larger areas, the systematic abandonment of these regions creates a chain of consequences that weakens the entire national structure, even though, for many, it may seem like just another phase of economic transition. And it is precisely in this tangle of decisions, interests, and omissions that the doubt arises that troubles any careful analysis. Is this transformation truly inevitable? Or is it the result of deliberate choices whose objectives have not yet been fully revealed? When hidden mechanisms begin to produce perceptible effects on the daily lives of cities, the result rarely manifests abruptly, instead emerging as a sequence of small signs that accumulate until they form a broad and alarming picture in which deterioration becomes impossible to ignore. The first visible consequence is economic contraction, which spreads rapidly through the most sensitive areas, drastically reducing job opportunities and leading thousands of families to a situation of continuous instability. This initial movement triggers a profound social impact because when employment disappears, the sense of community purpose weakens and the ability to maintain a minimum life structure silently disintegrates. As this process progresses, more severe changes emerge in the dynamics of cities. Schools close due to a lack of students, hospitals suffer from a scarcity of resources, and the commercial network, which previously sustained the local flow, loses its base, transforming into streets marked by locked doors and unmaintained facades. These transformations generate a domino effect that affects not only the economy, but also public safety, since abandoned neighborhoods become fertile ground for illicit activities and risky situations, amplifying the feeling of vulnerability that spreads throughout entire communities. The deterioration of infrastructure, aggravated by decreased state investment, creates an even more worrying cycle as poorly lit streets, abandoned buildings, and outdated services contribute to the gradual displacement of the population, intensifying the depopulation that had already begun. However, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these consequences is the way they expand silently, reaching regions that previously seemed immune to this decline, and revealing that this crisis is not restricted to smaller centers, but is preparing the ground to reach metropolitan centers that, until then, were seen as indestructible. Faced with this set of signs, which accumulate with the precision of a gear that never slows down, an inevitable question remains that needs to be confronted before the next step can be taken. What happens when the crisis left on the streets also transforms into a crisis within people? Comment: do you believe the next phase will be social, emotional, or both at the same time? As the economic and social effects of the decline deepen, a less visible yet significantly more devastating consequence begins to solidify as the most profound mark of this transformation, the sense of modern emptiness that settles not only in physical spaces, but mainly in the emotional sphere of people who are still trying to adapt to this new reality. Society, built for decades on the promise of unlimited progress, ends up confronting a disturbing paradox in which technological abundance and constant access to information fail to fill the growing absence of authentic human connections, creating an environment where loneliness becomes as present as the very air breathed in the silent streets. This phenomenon doesn't emerge abruptly. It gradually infiltrates the routines of communities, transforming apartments once teeming with life into compartments illuminated only by screens, where artificial lighting replaces conversations, encounters, and the bonds that sustained the feeling of belonging. The constant presence of devices and virtual networks, which should bring people closer, paradoxically amplifies emotional distance, intensifying the perception that something essential has been lost in the transition to this new social structure marked by individualism and disconnection. In cities undergoing a process of depopulation, this feeling becomes even more intense, as the silence of the streets not only reveals the absence of physical movement, but also reflects the symbolic emptying of the relationships that sustained the local dynamic. Public spaces once intended for social interaction are transformed into deserted areas, where the echo of footsteps replaces spontaneous interaction, and the perception of emotional vulnerability becomes as tangible as the abandoned facades that multiply. The result is an era in which many people, even surrounded by entire, still functional structures, feel disconnected from themselves and from each other, living within a void that cannot be filled by consumption, technology, or material comfort. This scenario raises a disturbing question that becomes essential to understanding the exact dimension of this phenomenon. To what extent is this emotional collapse merely a consequence of urban decay? Or is it in fact the true engine that silently accelerates this process? As the feeling of emotional emptiness becomes more evident, concrete data begins to reveal that the phenomenon is not merely subjective, nor limited to individual perception, but rather a direct reflection of alarming indicators accumulating outside the field of vision of most of the population. These numbers, often ignored or presented superficially by official sources, accurately expose the depth of a crisis that advances like an underground current, compromising the stability of millions of people without the public discourse keeping pace with the gravity of the facts. Among the most revealing indicators is the growing number of citizens who depend on food banks to meet basic needs, a rate that surpasses values observed in historically dramatic periods and demonstrates the weakening of an economic system that can no longer guarantee the minimum security of a large part of the population. At the same time, personal debt is reaching levels that exceed any previous record, configuring itself as a kind of financial trap that imprisons entire families, preventing prospects of stability in the medium and long term. These data, when analyzed together, reveal that the crisis, far from being episodic, has become structural. Another critical point is the growing number of cities with accelerated rates of population decline, some registering such intense drops that they resemble phenomena associated with natural disasters or extreme war crises, even though such events have not occurred in these locations. This abrupt decrease in the active population directly affects tax collection, the maintenance of essential services, and the basic functioning of the institutions that sustain urban life, creating a cycle of deterioration that is increasingly difficult to reverse. Even so, much of this data remains on the margins of central discussions, diluted in technical reports or mentioned in isolation, without the necessary emphasis for society to understand the scope of what is happening. And it is precisely in this disconnect between numbers and public narrative that the inevitable question arises, the one that precedes the most critical stage of this investigation. What do these silent data reveal about the immediate future of the cities that are still resisting? When the hidden numbers finally become visible and reveal a much broader reality than what is perceived on the surface, understanding what is approaching ceases to be mere speculation and becomes a concrete warning whose gravity intensifies as one observes the speed at which certain patterns repeat themselves in different regions of the country. The decline that previously seemed concentrated in small towns, treated as a geographical peculiarity or an isolated phenomenon, is now unfolding towards metropolitan areas, reaching zones that have historically remained stable and that for a long time were seen as examples of economic and social resilience. This continuous progress suggests that the problem lies not only in deteriorated infrastructure or lack of investment, but in the formation of a cycle that, once initiated, tends to expand until it reaches all vulnerable points in modern society. With this, there is also a growing perception that security, once considered a fundamental pillar for the functioning of metropolises, is beginning to suffer significant erosion, reflected in the increase of degraded areas, the reduction of community presence, and the widespread feeling of risk that spreads even among those who until recently believed themselves to be far removed from these consequences. Furthermore, the emotional exhaustion observed in the population, coupled with economic instability, indicates that the country is not only facing a tangible collapse, but a psychological erosion that compromises the capacity for collective reaction. When silent fear takes hold and becomes normalized, it opens the door to drastic changes in how people behave, organize themselves, and perceive their own future, creating an environment in which any additional shock can trigger profound and unexpected ruptures. Given this scenario, it becomes evident that the country is approaching a critical point, a moment in which every choice, every policy, and every omission will have a direct impact on the survival of the communities that still resist. And it is precisely at this decisive stage that the question preceding the final reflection of this documentary arises, a question that needs to be carefully analyzed before the silence becomes irreversible. What really happens when an entire nation begins to lose the ability to sense its own collapse? Comment: do you believe we've already passed the point of no return, or is there still time to reverse course? As the analysis reaches its conclusion, it becomes inevitable to recognize that what is happening in American cities transcends any simple interpretation based solely on statistics, deteriorated infrastructure, or episodic economic crises. The true impact of this process is revealed when one observes how the external emptiness slowly transforms into a direct reflection of the internal emptiness experienced by millions of people who silently try to understand how an entire society can distance itself so profoundly from itself without realizing the extent of this distance. Amidst the silence of the streets, the darkened shop windows, and the spaces that have lost their own social function, the perception emerges that the collapse is not limited to what physically collapses, but also to what ceases to pulsate within human relationships, collective memory, and the identity that sustained the idea of community. When a nation begins to live with the normalization of loneliness, instability, and hopelessness, what breaks down is not only the urban fabric, but the very emotional foundation that should keep people connected, strengthened, and capable of rebuilding what is falling apart around them. The absence of deep bonds, coupled with the spiritual weariness that spreads among individuals, creates an atmosphere in which the future ceases to be seen as a promise and begins to be perceived as an uncertain territory, marked by constant doubts and the feeling that the structure that once sustained the collective dream no longer offers the necessary security to inspire confidence. In this context, the silence that spreads through streets, houses, and communities takes on a new meaning, as it no longer represents merely a state of physical abandonment, but rather a reflection of an ever-increasing disconnection between people and the world around them. Thus, before concluding this investigation, one last reflection remains, echoing as an invitation for each observer to honestly assess what can still be preserved. Collapse does not begin when everything ends. It begins when everyone stops feeling. If this analysis helped you see what most people ignore, subscribe to the channel and stay with us, because there's still so much being hidden, and you deserve to know every truth before they erase everything.